Hello everybody, this is Brian Spivey, your ELA ISS for grades 6 through 12 in mainland Japan in the Pacific East. Today, we're going to build on a tool that was introduced in our Quarter 1 session, the Standards Align Assessment Planner. We're going to focus on using writing to formatively assess and summatively assess our students. And we're going to utilize a tool that you were introduced to earlier in the day, the single point rubric. So to quickly review, this document comes in two parts. The first part is the instructions for how to use it, and the second part is a graphic organizer that you will use to unpack your standards, create learning targets, and figure out how to assess those standards. So that's the things you're going to be planning as is highlighted in this bulleted list here. Identifying your priority standards, identifying the learning targets embedded in those standards, then how and when you're going to assess each standard and each learning target within the standard. I will quickly review the 4 steps. You're going to write the language of the content standard you're targeting. You're going to deconstruct the standard. Based on that deconstruction, where you're looking at the verbs, the context, you want to determine how you're going to assess the standard. And then you're going to figure out an approximate date that you plan to deliver this assessment. Now, I'm going to be focusing on an ELA standard. Susan Morris is going to be focusing on a social studies example. You probably want to view both of those just to see how they look the same and how they look different. So the standard that I have chosen comes from the 910 grade band. It is RI, which means reading informational text, 910, the grade level, and standard 6, which is determine author's point of view or purpose in a text and analyze how that author uses rhetoric to advance that point of view or purpose. And the text we're looking at is from the grade 10 collections it's an excerpt from an essay, Hope for Animals and Their World. So first, now that we've selected our standard, we're going to look at the verbs, which tell students what they should be doing. I want to add in a note here that in secondary grades, most standards are complex enough that each one will have multiple learning targets embedded within them, and you will see that this is a perfect example of that. In this standard, we have 2 verbs. The first is determine, and the second is analyze. However, we're going to talk about later how we have another verb embedded into these skills. So as we scroll down, we'll see that I also introduced the verb identify and have a learning target for that. As we start getting into the learning targets, I'll talk about that a little bit more. But for now, we're also going to look at the nouns and descriptors to give our verb context. So what are they going to determine? They're going to determine an author's point of view or purpose in a text. So I've got that here. We've got determine an author's point of view in a text. Now you can see here that I divided author's point of view and purpose into 2 different learning targets. Often we will choose one or the other of these, but for my purposes today, because I am laying the foundation for looking at arguments that I'm going to teach later, I'm going to look at both of these separately. So what we've got here for our first learning target is that students will state an author's point of view in the excerpt from Hope for Animals and Their World by Jane Goodall. You notice I incorporated the text into the learning target. We want to be very text specific in our learning targets. I'm going to skip the assessment column at this point, and I'm going to scroll down. So you can see here that I added the skill identify. And what are they going to identify? The rhetoric Jane Goodall uses to support her point of view. So this is a skill that is embedded in the standard because they're being asked to analyze rhetoric. But before they can analyze it, they need to be able to identify it. And I might have some students coming into my class who would struggle with that skill because they might not have the background information. So in order to provide that support, I'm going to plan on teaching them some rhetorical strategies and teaching them to identify rhetoric. So we come up with the um, goal that the learning target, that students will identify examples of rhetoric Jane Goodall uses to support her point of view that they have identified. So they have identified the point of view. Now they're going to identify some rhetoric that supports that point of view. So now that they have identified the different examples of rhetoric, they're going to then move to their analysis. So they're going to analyze. What are they going to analyze? And once again, I said earlier that analyze is one of the most overused verbs in education. So whenever we tell a student to analyze something, we have to give them context for that. We have to narrow down the scope by saying, you want to analyze it for what? In this case, they want to analyze how an author uses rhetoric to advance that point of view that we have identified earlier. So in this case, students will cite examples of rhetoric Jane Goodall uses to support the identified point of view, the point of view that they earlier identified. So we've gotten through the first task, which is determining an author's point of view in a text. So we're going to move on now to the second half, which is the author's purpose in a text. And it's very much like this. We're going to determine an author's purpose in a text. So the learning target there is students will state the purpose of the essay, Hope for Animals in Their World, or at least the excerpt. And once again, we've got the identify here because we want them to identify examples of rhetoric that support this purpose for writing the text. So this rhetoric that she uses, how does that help them tell what the purpose of the text is? And then we've got, of course, analyze. Analyze how an author uses rhetoric to advance the purpose for the text. So students will analyze the most effective rhetoric used by Jane Goodall that shows the purpose of the essay, Hope for Animals in Their World. Now, as you look, you will see that I have also added another verb to this list because this is going to lead directly to students being able to analyze arguments and write arguments later on. So that's standard 8 on the 9-10 grade level, where they have to evaluate the effectiveness of an argument. So in this case, I'm going to have them evaluate the effectiveness of the rhetoric used to support the point of view and the purpose of the essay. Our learning target is students will evaluate how effective Jane Goodall is in her use of rhetoric to support her point of view and the purpose for the essay, Hope for Animals in Their World. Now, this was not a required step, but since I'm looking forward and I know what I want to do in the future, I know that this standard really lays the groundwork for analyzing arguments. And this is a very argumentative, persuasive essay that Jane Goodall has written. So we have created our learning targets. Now we're going to go back and look at assessing. There are many ways to assess a standard and a learning target. And these formative assessments that we're going to do in the first stages really are just the assignments that they have to do that I can really look at very quickly, check off whether or not they understand the work, whether or not they need more support. So the assessment for this first learning target is I will provide students with some sentence frames and they will write a one-sentence statement of Jane Goodall's point of view in the text. And the reason I would provide that sentence frame is because um, students tend to overcomplicate something that's very simple. You should be able to write the point of view in one sentence, one very simple sentence, as a matter of fact. And so I want to teach them how to do that. So for our identify, as far as author's point of view, students will use a graphic organizer to identify specific examples of rhetoric Jane Goodall uses to support her point of view. So in this graphic organizer, I would have them identifying some rhetoric, probably identify what type of rhetorical device she's using, and then I would have them explain how this supports her point of view. And then our assessment for analyzing, we're getting into some writing here. Um, so our analysis would be written in a one paragraph assignment. So students will write a paragraph explaining Jane Goodall's point of view in the essay Hope for Animals in Their World with examples of rhetoric and how they support it and how the rhetoric supports this point of view. We have something very similar for looking at the purpose of the text. Once again, I will give them a sentence frame and they will write a one sentence purpose for the text. They will identify rhetoric and rhetorical devices that support that purpose, and then they will write a paragraph explaining the purpose of the essay, which includes examples of rhetoric that supports that purpose. These are my summative assessments, which leads to these are my formative assessments, which leads to my summative assessment for this assignment, which will be a full-blown essay. So based on the identified point of view, the identified purpose, and the intended audience, which we would talk about, I would have to provide them with instruction for that. For the essay, Hope for Animals in Their World, students will write an essay that evaluates the effectiveness of rhetoric Jane Goodall uses to support her point of view and purpose. So what we're really looking at there is, what is the purpose of the essay, and then what is the point of view in the essay, and how well does she use rhetoric to support that? Now that goes beyond the standard a little bit, but it lays a really good foundation for argumentation. So now that we have looked at our learning targets and how we're going to assess those learning targets, let's take a look at our tool, the single point rubric. So this is one that I have come up with. It is it's a very simple 3-column chart. And in this 3-column chart, you have areas for improvement, you have your criteria, and then evidence for exceeding the standards. There are different models for 3-point rubrics, but this is a pretty common one that I saw as I did my research. The rubrics are based on Dodea's common writing formative and explanatory rubrics. So I'm going to open that up and let you take a look at it. That's this rubric right here. So this is very easy to find. And what we're focusing on for this is the criteria of development of ideas and organization. So for this assignment, that's what I'm focusing on, development of ideas. I'm just taking part of that, and I'm looking at organization. So based on that rubric, based on those bullet points in that rubric more specifically, I came up with some criteria, and then I just typed in some language to make it apply specifically to this assignment. So for my criteria, I want them to address the prompt. I want to make sure that they're on topic. I want them to provide effective and comprehensive development. What does that comprehensive and effective development look like? They're going to provide evidence of Jane Goodall's use of rhetoric, which we had them do in a graphic organizer. And then they're going to effectively organize the response with clear and coherent writing. That's language straight from the rubric. And how are they going to do that? They're going to explain how the rhetoric supports Jane Goodall's point of view. So this is a rubric for one paragraph, for the one paragraph assignment. We have one for the point of view paragraph, and also we have one for the author's purpose paragraph. So something I added to this assignment because I wanted it to be something that the students could use is that I had them look at the feedback that I provide, and then I want them to write down the action steps that they're going to take based on that feedback. Now, feedback to me is the best part of a single point rubric, because if you have a rubric with bullet points, like the rubric that we use for Dodea, it tends to be a little bit inflexible. because you have to stick with the things that are written in the bullet points. In this rubric, however, you can freely give feedback. And we talked about for an assessment capable learner, the importance of timely and specific feedback. So you can give them whatever feedback they require in order to meet the criteria. However, there's something else that we can do here too. We can say, okay, if this student is really one of my advanced students, and not only have they met the criteria, they've gone beyond the criteria, we're going to write down, well, not only did you do what I asked you to do, you went beyond it, and that's how you did it here. It may be their use of language, it may be that they dug deeper than they were required to, or else something else you can do if you have a student who is meeting the criteria, you can say, well, if you want to go beyond that, here are some things that you can do. So this rubric really has a lot of flexibility. You could also give this to students and have them critique their own writing, or else they can critique each other's writing in teams or in pairs. So there's a lot of freedom that this single point rubric gives you. Then if you pair it with the action steps that they need to take, that gives them a chance to monitor their own learning, can be a very powerful tool. So we have the same thing here for the purpose. Oh, and I've got a typo in purpose. So that is our 3-point rubric that we're going to look at. And we're going, once again, going to use that to grade the 2 paragraphs where they're going to provide analysis. Now, if we're looking at the evaluate assignment, I think there are options. You could create a more in-depth 3-point rubric based on that. Or you could use, I would either use a 3-point rubric, or else I would take the rubric for the grade level, the informational writing rubric for the grade level, and I would do an analytic rubric with that by giving them a score in each area. You have a lot of options with the use of rubrics in this lesson. So now that I have mapped out my learning and how I'm going to assess students, I want to figure out, when am I going to do this? Because as we know, assessments can be tricky. We want to have a plan ahead of time because we do want to provide students with timely feedback. And that is why for these summative assessments, these are just assignments that they're going to be doing in class. This is a 1-sentence assignment that will tell us whether or not our students are learning. I can check that as they go. So if I'm starting this lesson on the 22nd of October, I'm going to get these 2 things done, the 1-sentence statement and the graphic organizer. I'm hoping that I can get these 2 things done in one double block class. They might be able to get started on their paragraph. I think I might be a little over aggressive, but the beauty of this is I might go in and change the date to a later date. But I want them to at least get it started on planning their paragraph. So once again, we've got the same thing with looking at the author's purpose. This is something that I'm hoping they can get done in 1 class period, possibly 2. And then looking at the evaluate learning target, because it's a full-length essay and I'm going to have to provide some instruction for it before they dig into it, I'm giving them some more time before I'm going to deliver this assessment. And that also gives me time after the assessment is delivered, the essay, because that gives me time to grade it, or what I would probably do is have them score it in pairs using the rubric that I'm utilizing. So as you can see, there are a lot of different options that we have for rubrics, and we just have to be pragmatic and intentional about how we're going to use them. So as we can see, using writing assignments to assess learning, as well as using rubrics, the combination of rubrics that we have available, is a very targeted and specific way to determine whether or not your students are learning what you're teaching and what feedback they might need to get the support that they require to meet your standards, to meet your criteria. Um, Of course, if you have any questions about this or need help getting started, you can always contact your local ELA ISS.